Well, a study in power ethics, which is what we're going to be continuing to look at this morning, is very important in light of the events of modern 20th century history that we see. Three of the great names that we looked at the past couple of studies of the ethics of power were Niccolo Machiavelli, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Karl Marx. We said that one was an Italian, the other two were Germans, although the Russian people are primarily the ones who employed the ideological philosophy of Karl Marx. And so what I want to do this morning in continuing to look at the ethics of power, which I think you'll find very interesting, is to tie in the philosophies of Machiavelli, Nietzsche, and Marx with the history of war in the 20th century. You'll see how the philosophies of these three men have so profoundly influenced the whole world. The very geographical setup of the countries of much of the world, much of Europe, much of Asia, we find dependent upon the history of war in the 20th century. Some people are maybe here, or some people are maybe not here because of the wars, depending on when fathers and so forth went away to battle and when they came home and different things like this. You have the so-called baby boom after World War II and the baby generation, who's now no longer a baby. They're up into their 30s now. But anyway, the whole globe has been affected by the series of important wars that we've had, especially World War I and World War II, that we had in this century. Just changed everyone's outlook. Before that time, the world had been in such a, what we might call a primitive state, and people got wise about things in a hurry. We've never had a world war before until the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. And it's changed the way the world functions today. It's hard to put yourself back into the 19th century and think as they would. That's right. They had many local battles. Most of the time it was battles with the Indians over here until we really got wise and fought against ourselves in the Civil War. And that was really bright of us, to murder ourselves and really deplete the population of the country. And even the countries over in Europe in the 19th century who had fought great battles with other countries, generally it was between two. And just about all wars are fought over territory. The only reason you go to battle with someone else is because they've got some land that you would like to have. That's just about 100% true for all battles. Someone wants to own something themselves. They don't want someone else to have it. So generally it's between two nations, and there was a boundary between them, and they didn't like where the boundary line was. They'd rather bring it away from themselves by 100 miles, and then they would fight over that. So it's no small thing that the 37th Psalm says that the earth belongs to us. We don't have to fight over the earth, that the meek are going to inherit the earth. Because it's just those people out there in the world who are not meek who are engaged in the world's wars. And what I find interesting is what they're fighting over. They're fighting over land. They're fighting over territory. And remember, might makes right. And because I'm stronger than you, then your land, that just means, somehow that just means, automatically, your land belongs to me. I'm entitled to it. Why should you have it? Because you don't have the military and the economic prosperity in your country that we have in ours. And we feel the same way in this country. For some reason, we feel because we have the political, the economic, the military prosperity, that we just have the right, just somehow the sovereign right, to intervene in Nicaragua, to intervene in El Salvador. We just feel like we have the right because of our prosperity and because of our power. Now, if we didn't have all of that, do you think we'd be fooling around down there? No. We would have enough trying to take care of our own. So you see, the only reason you try to expand is because really you want to take something that belongs to someone else. You like the thought of asserting your power even if you don't keep what you take. We pride ourselves in giving it back, but we still are falling into the same trap of the ethics of power. And the Bible says that the meek are going to inherit the earth, not win it through war, not win it through battle. And the meek are just the opposite of the warmongers of the world. They're just the opposite. They're two opposites, a meek person and a warring person. They're just opposites. And yet the goal is the same for both of us. And they obtain it only to lose it to someone else who's stronger. There's always someone stronger than you in the world. There's always someone stronger. Maybe not today, but tomorrow. Amen. There will be. There's always someone brighter than you somewhere in the world. Man is so prideful about what he thinks that he has and what he thinks that he is. Just because he hasn't met all 5 billion of the people on this planet. If you would have met personally all 5 billion of the people, you'd lose a lot of your pride in a hurry. You're not so glamorous after all. You're not so handsome after all. All you've seen are those 5 people that you meet on your job. And they don't look anything like you look. They don't have the prosperity, the wisdom that you have. Yet when you expand your boundaries to get out into the world, you find out how small man really is. Amen. And you find why he's going to be without excuse, because he's so prideful of himself, and he's nothing at all. He's nothing at all, because there's always someone, you know, you see these supermodels like, well, I won't mention any names, but the 2 popular American names of supermodels, and yet you could go into the depths of some country that's hardly been heard of and find just an average peasant girl that far surpasses them. Because she doesn't have any makeup at on, just natural beauty. She far surpasses them. You see these great, huge, muscle-bound men that are supposed to be so strong. You could find some little skinny fella who all of his life, he's probably about 65 or 70, who all of his life has lifted these huge loads onto his back. You know, a poor, poverty-stricken fellow in the depths of Africa or South America, and he could lift a lot more than the muscle-bound fellow could. That's the deceptions of Satan in the world. It's the glamour and the image that people portray. Well, anyway, to get back on our subject of power ethics, I want to go into a little bit of a study of the history of wars in the 20th century. Some brother in the church said just a couple of weeks ago, I sure didn't know we were going to study all of this in Christian ethics. Amen. That's because he and maybe you were thinking about the practice of ethics and not the foundation for it. That's right. You were thinking of the latter part of the class and not the beginning of it. So we only have maybe till next spring or next summer or something like that to go through a lot of the foundation introduction, and then we'll get into the practice of ethics. Sounds like a long time away, but time passes quickly, very, very quickly. We need to cherish the time that we have. Well, I want you to notice how these 3 names, Niccolo Machiavelli, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Karl Marx, tie in so directly with 3 of the great war powers of this century. So let's start with Niccolo Machiavelli. What country was he from? Italy, a great Italian statesman, a great Italian writer and philosopher. We have as his ideological descendant the fascist government of Benito Mussolini. It's interesting that 3 of the great war powers of this century, their philosophies and ideologies have come right from the writings of people who were either from that country or had a profound influence upon the people of the country, upon the thought pattern of the leaders in government positions and in control of what's going on in that country. Machiavelli is an Italian, and when you think about the war powers of this century, Benito Mussolini could hardly escape your mind, your remembrance, your imagination, as being the founding father of the fascist movement. We've got fascist political parties right here in the United States. It's still around today. He advocated a totalitarian government. Sounds a lot like Machiavelli. Remember, we said that Machiavelli said that the best government is a government of absolutism. He said a democracy is no good because it spreads the power out among too many people, and an autocracy with its few leaders has few too many leaders. The best government is an absolute government where you have a supreme leader. Mussolini was never known as a king or a prime minister, something like that, but a supreme dictator, a supreme totalitarian leader. He began his life with a rough childhood in poverty And before he started bullying the nations around, I think he was thrown out of school at least twice for stabbing students with his pencils and pens. So he started off rough in life. And he started off as a socialist, following the writings of Marx in Das Kapital. When he ran away from home, one thing he had was a little medallion with an imprint of the picture of Karl Marx upon it. And he also had a copy of Das Kapital, where he, in studying the writings of Marx, came to see what he thought was true about all of the economic problems that the recently unified state of Italy was experiencing, which he thought he could trace back to capitalism, which is what Marx was doing. Marx was saying the problem with the world and her wars is the problem of capitalism. It's because you're exploiting the masses. It's because you don't give the masses proper pay. It's because you don't give the proletariat class the ownership of the means of production that we have these problems like we've discussed before in the French Revolution. What was it that caused the French Revolution? Was it the nobility? No. Was it the bourgeoisie? No. It was the proletariat class. The storming of the Bastille in July of 1789, the bread march by the thousands of women on the city of Paris. Why? It's because, so they would say, of the capitalistic society. Remember, France was the first nation that went through the Industrial Revolution. France was followed by Britain, and Britain was followed by the United States of America. It took a good while before the Industrial Revolution spread overseas to the New World. But it began in France. And it had been going on some time, had been preceded by what was called the Age of Reason in Europe, or the Age of the Enlightenment, where man began to throw off these medieval Roman Catholic notions about the world, about sex, about himself, about his government, about employment, about his thought patterns concerning everything. The great age of enlightenment with people like the French philosopher Voltaire, who told people, although I will respect your right to opinion, I may disagree 100%. Everyone at that time came to their own. It was kind of like coming of age in Europe during that day, where everyone came to age of having their own ideas, their own independent thoughts. It was the age of individualism. Everyone was to be an individual and think about things and practice higher criticism against not only the Bible, but against all that you'd been taught before. And so they thought that following upon the heels of this age of enlightenment and the age of reason, which had followed the dark ages, nothing happening, nothing going on in the world or in the church, we've got the Industrial Revolution. Along with the Industrial Revolution, you have the invention of things like Robert Clermont's, the Clermont steamboat. You have the various threshing instruments, the various combine instruments. They were crude, not like we have today, but that were able to mass produce things like never before. That's what the Industrial Revolution was all about, mass production. Used to have one little thing made one at a time. And now we could get one of these big steam engines really powered up and really going and really put out a lot of one particular item. And for the first time, you'd have uniform production. Before that, depending on who made the item was going to be different. Is that true today? No. You can have one little item and you'll have 10 million of them identical. Not one thing different in 10 million of them. But yet, because they didn't have conveyor belts, they didn't have an assembly line. That was Henry Ford's production, was the assembly line. No one had thought of an assembly line before Henry Ford came on the scene in the early decades of this century, right here in this country, as a matter of fact. So what I'm saying is, although you had the means of production, what was going to happen to all of those goods once they came out of whatever machine that was doing it? Well, you employed women and children by the hundreds in the local factories to put all these things together and to get them ready to go out to ship them out. So the problem is, look what the women are going through. Look what the children are going through. And look what many of the men were going through as well. What's the problem? Well, it's capitalism. We are exploiting the masses for sake of the bourgeoisie and for sake of the nobility. And so Mussolini's following right in the thought pattern of Karl Marx, that this is the problem of the world. Remember, the very first sentence of the Communist Manifesto says that the problems and the wars of the world are on the basis of class struggles. As a matter of fact, Mussolini founded a newspaper himself entitled Class Struggle. This was back in his early life. We'll see in a moment that he eventually gave it up. It was a short 4-page paper, all of which he wrote himself, that he entitled Class Struggle, after Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto from his boyhood idol Karl Marx. But because of the recent unification of the various warring city-states of Italy in the end of the 19th century, Italy had become a country for the first time, and as a result was faced with serious economic problems. And it didn't seem like they were caused by industrial revolution, because the problems were so widespread, and because the problems were spread through all three classes. They weren't just confined to the lower class. You had the disillusionment of life in the bourgeoisie as well as among the nobility. It wasn't confined or restricted to the lower class. So he gave up following Karl Marx, and he gave up his socialist ideas. In early February of 1918, I have a quote from one of his speeches. He began around this time advocating dictatorship. We're toward the end of World War I, and he was disillusioned over World War I. Didn't look like it had been caused by class struggles. We started off this morning saying things aren't caused by class struggle. They're caused because you want to take over someone else's territory. The only class struggle that enters in is when you've got a civil war on your hands. And that wasn't even true here in this country. It was over another issue. It wasn't over lower class, middle class, and upper class. You see, just because that happened in the French Revolution doesn't mean that's always true in every civil revolution that's come since that time, because history has proven that to be false. That's not been the reason. And if it's the reason, it's not the reason for war between nations. It's only the reason for a civil war within one nation. Obviously, the lower class would be fighting against the bourgeoisie and against the ancient nobility. So he was disillusioned with the war. It hadn't been caused by the great dangers and evils that Marx had preached so violently of capitalism. It had been caused by the greed, the lust for power. So in February of 1918, he said the following. He said that he advocated, we're talking now about Italy since that's where he was from, the rise of a man who is ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep of everything. A man who is ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep of everything. What did Machiavelli say? He said a human leader should be like a fox, like a human fox, who keeps the interest of people in mind whenever things are going his way and in his favor, and when situations change, give them up. In other words, keep the truth, keep faith whenever things are going well, whenever things turn against you, whenever a new situation arises, and give it up. It's the principle of expediency versus morality, which is exactly what Machiavelli taught. He said that right is whatever makes the state strong. There's a good definition of what's right. Not a biblical definition, but an easy definition of what's right. What's right? Right is whatever makes the state stronger, whatever makes the state more powerful. In other words, we want more power in our state, not less. And whatever we can do to gain that, it's right. Automatically, it becomes right. Because our one goal is dictatorship. Our one goal is totalitarianism. So he began advocating that. He began having a few followers prior to February of 1918 who were following his leadership. The fascist party had already been formed by this time. He wasn't in control or anything like that, but he was one of the great speakers of Italy of that day, which we'll comment more on here in a moment. But it wasn't until around 1920 or 1921, after the end of World War I, that he began being a little more specific about this ruthless, energetic man. He just said that he advocated the rise, the dictatorial rise of this ruthless individual, but he didn't say who it was. until around 1920 or 1921, and he began putting himself across to be the perfect, ruthless, energetic figure to completely turn the nation of Italy around. And so in 1922, after a tremendous speech before 40,000 fascists, they marched on Rome and in a coup d'etat overthrew the government of Italy, complete with their black shirts and their flags with skulls and so forth. The one thing about Mussolini that not only captivated the people of Italy, but captivated the whole world was his oratorical abilities and was his personal appearance. He was a huge, muscular type fella with a jutting jaw and jet black eyes that had probably the most remarkable oratorical abilities of anybody who's lived in this century. It was said of one American cardinal in Boston around that time that he felt that Mussolini was God's gift to Italy. And if that's not enough, Churchill, Winston Churchill himself, this was before all that Mussolini calls came about, Winston Churchill himself said that had he been an Italian, the first thing he would have done was join the fascist party to follow Mussolini. This was before he had his eyes open later to what Mussolini was going to do. Why? Because of his speaking abilities. He would stand up on his little balcony with his arms folded across his chest. You see, that's where some of these images and figures come today. You didn't used to find people in that defiant stance with your arms folded across your chest, your legs spread out slightly. You just look like an imposing Titanic Atlas figure. That's exactly what Mussolini did. He was a tremendous figure in personal appearance before. He would just have women weep and faint right in his presence with his tremendous speaking abilities. So he didn't just capture Italy with those abilities, he deceived the whole world. He was compared to the ancient Caesars. Remember, we're talking about Rome. He was thought of as the reincarnation of the great Caesars of Rome because he was the leader of Rome. He was compared to Napoleon. He was compared to Oliver Cromwell. This wasn't by Italians. This was by other Europeans as well as by Americans. The whole world thought the most and thought the best of Benito Mussolini. And yet with his speech before these 40,000 fascists and the overthrow and the coup d'etat of the Italian government in the spring of 1922, he gained control of the fascist party of Italy and became himself the absolute dictator. In June of 1940, he entered World War II on the side of the Germans. So we're talking now 20 years later. For 20 years, the great El Duce, as the Italians referred to him, El Duce had held absolute totalitarian dictatorial power and sway over the country of Italy. They got their name, the Fascist Party, by the way, from the ancient symbol of the lictors, who were an ancient group of people who led the way into a public procession of the imperial leaders behind them. And they would have as their symbol this little band of sticks and twigs and things like this, and an axe coming up out of it. You've probably seen that before. It's known as the fasces. And they took that as their symbol, and thus the name of the party, the Fascist Party. So they were trying, in other words, to found themselves to show the Italian people that they had roots back in imperial Rome. We're talking about 2,000 years ago, imperial Rome. And because of the little symbol that the lictors would carry in the entourage for the public ceremony of some great leader of the city or of the Senate or of the state there in Rome or of Caesar himself, of the branches and the twigs and the axe coming up in the middle, then they adopted that as the name of their party, the Fascist Party. So anyway, he enters World War II about 8 months after Germany enters World War II. We're primarily mentioning him because of the totalitarian government he established in Italy, because Italy was not very effective in World War II. He started off, even before entering the war, taking a couple of countries himself, but they were countries that were insignificant to what the Germans went on to do later on. He thought that Adolf Hitler, I believe he called him one time a silly little cat. He thought he was a madman. And Hitler just practically worshipped Mussolini. Hitler thought Mussolini was the greatest man who had ever lived. And so Mussolini, in other words, had the upper hand on Hitler. He thought Hitler was a little crazed, grown-up child. He was a madman. And yet Hitler was a lot smarter than Mussolini or anyone else thought he was. He was certainly mad, but a mad scientist can be one of the brightest ones around. Because what caused the problems between Italy and Germany, even after the so-called Pact of Steel that they entered with one another, the beginning of World War II, was that whenever he would travel to Munich or to Berlin after the Rome-Berlin Axis had been signed, that he was always, as well as the other Italians, always excluded from the talks of Hitler and his German field marshals and his generals and his lieutenants concerning war plans. Because it was a popular saying among the German political war leaders then that all Italians are like talking gypsies. If you tell them anything, they're going to go talking about it and tell others about it. And so it really made Mussolini just furious. And so to get back at Germany, he attacked Greece, which was not part of the plan of the Rome-Berlin Axis agreement. And he wasn't nearly strong enough to take it, and as a result, this was one of the reasons that led toward the demise of Germany and Hitler, because Hitler had to come and bail him out, had to send many of his troops down into Greece to bail Mussolini out, as well as down into North Africa when he tried later on to take some more of North Africa from what he had already taken prior to that. And so on July the 24th, 1943, Italy has done nothing but fail in the Second World War. And he's summoned to appear before the leaders of the fascist party, and he doesn't appear, and so they depose him as leader. They put him right out of his office, and he doesn't really take them serious for what they do. So he shows up one day in an audience before the King of Italy, and he's arrested by the soldiers from the fascist council, and he's exiled, first of all to one island and then to another island, and then finally he's exiled to a house way on the top of a huge high range of mountains because they didn't want him to ever escape, and more importantly, they didn't want anyone to ever come and get him. Whenever the Germans found out about it, it was a nearly impregnable place. It was almost impossible to get up the side of the mountain without a lot of difficulty. So whenever the Germans found out about the predicament that Mussolini was in, then Hitler ordered him kidnapped. He sent some of his best, well, they weren't pilots, they weren't soldiers, of all things, they were gliders. Germany had perfected the art of gliding during that day, and he sent some of his best gliders who did crash land into the top of this mountain and somehow managed to kidnap Mussolini, capture him, and take him back to Munich. The reason Hitler wanted to get him back to Munich was so that he could reestablish Mussolini more or less as a puppet under his control with a new fascist power and a new fascist party, and most importantly, a new fascist army to support the party and to support Hitler in northern Italy. And so this was the goal of Hitler, and this was what was in his mind behind the command to kidnap Mussolini. So he does set up a new fascist party. He does raise a new fascist army in northern Italy, which doesn't do anything but soon succumb to the southern fascist party. And finally, whenever the Axis powers, or whenever the Allied powers are approaching Italy very fast, on April the 28th in 1945, he tried to escape across the border disguised as a German, and he was caught and shot dead on the spot. And so what we're saying is that his government was patterned directly on the precepts and the thoughts of Machiavelli. As a matter of fact, he had submitted a thesis on Machiavelli for his doctor's degree to show the thought pattern behind Mussolini. Now, Italy no longer is a totalitarian government, but it was of that day. It lasted for 20 years under Benito Mussolini. And so it's no small thing to see the connection between Machiavelli and Benito Mussolini. He actually did a paper on it to get his doctor's degree. He was a very, very intelligent man. Mussolini was extremely bright. He was quarrelsome in school, and whenever he did end up in higher education later on, he passed all A's all the time. He was a very, very bright individual. So you see the connection now between Machiavelli and the totalitarian state of Italy under Benito Mussolini. Okay, the next figure that we talked about was Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a German and who was the forerunner of the ideological stepchild of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi government. You see, it's just not a coincidence that the totalitarian war powers of this century rose up from Italy in the first place and rose up from Germany in the second place. Why not from Switzerland? Why not from Sweden? Why not from Turkey? Why from Italy? Why from Germany? Well, we're talking about the tremendous influence that Machiavelli had had on the Italian people as well as the whole world, and that Friedrich Nietzsche had had on the German people. It was just a step of preparation for what was going to come now that we've seen in this 20th century. Well, a lot of people know about some of the life of Adolf Hitler, so we'll just kind of sum it up briefly for you. He wanted to be an artist when he was a child, which showed his metaphysical tendencies to kind of wander off in thoughts about different things. You know, the best artist today has to be the one who can paint a picture so that when you put it on your wall, you don't know whether it's upside down or right side up. And if you can paint a picture like that, you're brilliant then. And if you can put it on the wall and you don't know whether it's upside down or right side up or whether it's supposed to maybe be turned against the wall so you can't see the picture, and then that makes that the picture. I never have understood pictures like that. I like a sunset or a horse grazing in the pasture or a deer or something like that. But all these wild colors look like a child painted it. You just spilled it and then you rubbed your hands to it and then you walked through it. Amen. Well, anyway, that's what Hitler wanted to be. He wanted to be one of the great artists of the world. But he wasn't any good. He failed twice trying to enter the National Art Academy of Germany, so he gave up after that. By the way, he wasn't very bright intellectually in comparison to Mussolini. Mussolini was brilliant, but Hitler wasn't. And so as a result, he enlisted in World War I. Couldn't be an art student and thought that he would enlist in World War I. Where he was wounded, I believe he was, well, it seems that he was a sharpshooter in World War I. And he was good at that. And he was very, very brave. He won one of the highest medals possible for his low rank that he had. And toward the end of the war, he was gassed as well. Some people have thought out loud that perhaps that's why Hitler had his problems later. He was gassed. It hurt his mind. He became deranged later in life. There's a possibility, but it would be better just to trace it back to demons, which is probably what caused it all. So throughout World War I, he's not famous at all, but he's serving his country well in his military role of fighting for the German army. After the end of World War I, in the beginning of the 1920s, he began to involve himself in German politics. He began to work his way up. He even opposed President Hindenburg on one occasion and lost, but he was extremely, extremely shrewd. And although he had opposed Hindenburg, the German president at this time, and had lost to him before, in, I think, 1933, Hindenburg, because of the shrewdness of Hitler, turned around and appointed Hitler to one of the highest positions in Germany, which you wouldn't think someone would do when you had actually run against them for president and had lost to them, that they're going to appoint you to anything. But that's because he was able to work things out. And you'll see as we go along how he did this in the eyes of the whole world. He was able to work things out in his favor to make him look like he wasn't such a bad guy after all. To make it look like that his true aims weren't what his actions portrayed them to be. That people thought other than what his actions were showing. And it's because of not his oratorical abilities, but because of the mass propaganda machine that Hitler started up in Nazi Germany. So after Hindenburg dies in 1934, he is appointed by the Reichstag as the supreme dictator of Germany. Now, we didn't have a dictatorship before this. We had a presidentship before this. So now, for the first time, we're ending up with a dictatorship in Germany. He wasn't the founding father of the Nazi movement. The Nazi movement had been started earlier. It's just an acronym for the German words, the National Socialist Movement of Germany. We end up with the abbreviation of Nazi. But he certainly came to the forefront in the politics of the Nazi Party just prior to being elevated to the dictatorship in 1934. And after doing this, he began to cast his reflections eastward, politically, geographically eastward, to the Slavic people to the east, with whom Germany had had many wars, many battles over many hundreds of years prior to that. Now, the problem that Hitler had that didn't face Mussolini was that Germany had been the culprit of World War I. Italy wasn't the culprit of World War I, it was Germany. And so there were just a multitude of sanctions and restrictions that had been placed upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, which had been signed in Paris, France at the end of World War I. And so Hitler somehow had to find out a way to get himself out of these sanctions and out of all of these restrictions. There were a lot of military restrictions that were put on the German people in the Treaty of Versailles concerning the arms race, concerning the building up of her armies. And the countries of the world, especially of Europe, were supposed to keep very good control, very good sight over what is going on in Germany these days. So Hitler very shrewdly was able, by means of mass propagation, probably this century's greatest propagandist was Adolf Hitler. He always made things look like what they really weren't. He always got people to think the best of him, when later on almost the whole world came to think of him as the Antichrist. That's how bad he really was. And yet, to begin with, just like Mussolini, we said Churchill said if I was an Italian, the first party I would have joined was the fascist party under Benito Mussolini, because of these great oratorical abilities. Well, it doesn't pay to listen to people's oratorical abilities. It doesn't pay, because you can speak real well and be real deceptive in the heart. It's exactly what Mussolini was, as well as Hitler. But by means of mass propaganda, he had the whole world convinced that he wasn't up to what he really was up to. And so he was able to build a lot of secret factories. During these years, the tonnage of the bombs, the armored carriers, the guns that were being produced in Germany were tremendous. Germany didn't have anything left over from World War I. Where in the world did she get the tonnage of bombs, of airplanes, of tanks, of armored carriers, of guns, of all types of munitions that she used during World War II? The Treaty of Versailles forbade this of Germany. And yet Germany ended up with all of it just like a surprise. Overnight she had all of it. Well, Hitler was very deceitful, very devious in what he did. He had these secret factories built, and they were just putting out these bombs by the thousands and storing them and hiding them because he had plans in mind. As I said, his plans were in the first place geared eastward. So, in the fall of 1939, the fateful day of, I believe, September the 1st, Hitler and the German army attacks Poland. We have the beginning of World War II. He had gotten some cooperation out of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia prior to this, but Poland resisted all of his advances, and he hated the Poles because of their resistance. He kind of wanted to talk them into surrendering, talk them into letting him have their country, and they weren't for any of that. And so that was the first country he attacked. Of course, he had his eyes on the Soviet Union, and in order to reach the Soviet Union, you've got to go through the country of Poland, which is exactly what he did. So he attacks Poland in the fall of 1939. Then immediately he turns west and attacks Denmark and Norway. France, remember the Treaty of Versailles had been signed in Paris after the French as well as their other comrades had defeated the Germans in World War I. France was the place where the Treaty of Versailles had been signed. And so one thing Hitler wanted to do was reverse the tables of history, and he wanted to stamp out the restrictions permanently on Germany imposed on them and him from the Treaty of Versailles, and he wanted to do it in the city of Paris. And so the French had been wise prior to World War II, after World War I, because of what Germany had done to France then, by building what was known as the Maginot Line. I don't know if you remember studying that in school or not, but it was named after a French lieutenant, I believe, who designed the famous Maginot Line, which extended the whole length between the French and the German border. It was a series of underground concrete bunkers that were impregnable. There's just about no way the Germans could take them. And they kept men there all the time. They kept a lot of munitions there. And yet there was no Maginot Line. There were no troops between the border that separated France from Belgium. And where did Hitler go whenever he attacked Denmark, Norway? He went up north. He went through Belgium. And he came down through France from the north. There was nothing to stop him at all. The Maginot Line, the French had spent millions and millions of dollars on this formidable line of defense known as the Maginot Line, and it was worthless to them. The Germans never tried to go through France directly. They came down from the Netherlands, from Belgium. They came down from the north. And they just stormed Paris. And because of all of the great architectural structures in Paris, the people in Paris didn't want to fight. It wasn't because they were afraid. It was because they knew that if we fight, they're going to bomb Paris. And if they bomb Paris, there goes things like the Eiffel Tower. There goes everything, because of the great buildings that Paris, France was, and to this day is known for. If she had not surrendered, Paris surrendered just about immediately, and which meant the whole country of France surrendered. If she wouldn't have surrendered, there'd be no Paris today, as we know, with all of these tremendous buildings that have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. So he did just what his aim was. We're going to cancel the Treaty of Versailles right in the Palace of Versailles in Paris, France, where it was signed against us back at the end of World War I. He had that goal in mind for years and years, and he was able to fulfill it. So after he takes Denmark, Norway, France, Switzerland was supposed to be neutral during this time. That was the thing to be neutral. Don't be dumb like some of the other countries and join in the battle and get beat as a result. So Switzerland went through the battle fairly well because she wouldn't fight for anybody. She just said, leave me and my Alps alone, and we'll leave you alone. And so once he gets to France, his next goal is to take Great Britain right off the map. Neville Chamberlain had died around this time. I think Chamberlain died around 1940, which would be the beginning of World War II. And the world-famous Sir Winston Churchill had become the great Prime Minister of the British Isles. And so with Hitler's nearly indestructible Luftwaffe, his air weapon, he just about bombed Great Britain right into the sea. You probably remember the stories and remember the accounts of the British people for months on end living in the air raid shelters, which were really nothing more than tunnels that had been dug out underneath the city of London, underneath all of Great Britain, at least in her major cities. And the Luftwaffe of Germany came over time and time again and just about bombed Great Britain right into the sea. And yet Churchill's claim was, we'll never give up our island. Through blood, sweat, and tears. That's where we get the phrase. Through blood, sweat, and tears, we will defend our island. The United States is not in the war at this time. The United States is sending supplies to Great Britain, but she's not declared war against Germany or against Italy. Remember, we're talking about Italy now when we get up into the summer of 1940. One thing that wasn't very successful for Hitler was his famous U-boats, who were supposed to be sinking all of the American ships that came over from America to Great Britain. But he attacked just enough to get the United States angry, and shortly thereafter the United States entered war. So one thing he failed on was his over-calculation of his own power of the Luftwaffe, which was his Air Force, the air weapon, the planes, which were very good and very famous against Great Britain. He had overestimated his own power. And so Britain kept him tied up for months and months. They had the opportunity to take Britain off the map, but there were several miscalculations militarily that kept Britain preserved. It's interesting when you study the histories of the wars of the world, just small decisions made by this leader or because of the advice he gets from this group of his field marshals, and he changes his mind about something, and the whole course of human history has been altered or has been preserved intact because of that one decision that was made. It'd be interesting if England was a Nazi government today, or worse, if it was a communist government today. England, Great Britain, it was a communist government. But it's not, at least not yet. Not that the Soviet Union doesn't have her eyes on the whole world. And so that's who he attacks next, is the Soviet Union. In the early part of 1941, Hitler goes after what his real goal was, and that was to attack Leningrad, the second most important, the second largest city in the Soviet Union, bring it to its knees, march on to Moscow, and take over the USSR. He was so confident, as a matter of fact, in his famous Sixth Army, he was so confident in his Sixth Army that he sent them in without supplies, he sent them in without food, he sent them in without winter clothes, because he said, I know we'll take them in a matter of just a few weeks. Well, one of the most famous battles in the history of the world is the Battle of Leningrad, that the Russian people put up a fierce resistant stand against the famous Sixth Army of Adolf Hitler. And they went on for months and months. And because it was started in the summertime, it took them all the way into the fall, it took them all the way into Russia's famous winters, bitterly cold. And they had no clothes. The Sixth Army had no clothes, except summer clothes.
For the continuation of this